Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I want to have a little chat about receptive or passive magic. This in particular is a type of magic, or at least a category that I've sort of coined for myself that I've been engaging in a lot recently. I mentioned it briefly in my recent vlog toward the end of the day when I was lighting candles on my altar, not really doing much, and I referred to what I was doing as a sort of passive sort of magic. And I thought I would define that a little bit more clearly and then maybe get a bit of a conversation going. I don't think that what I'm doing is anything that is new or groundbreaking, but I think the way that I might be thinking about it or choosing to view it and utilize it might be useful or inspiring for somebody out there who has a similar sort of practice. I would say contends with similar sorts of obstacles and elements within their magical world. I think it can be difficult to maintain, and constantly be fueling a magical or spiritual practice in a very active way. And so I view the receptive or passive magic to be a complement to the more active side of my practice. I think it's very easy to think of magic in its entirety as being quite active, or unintentionally thinking actively in a way of magic. We are constantly seeking to do something. We have lots of sort of mottos and chants and sayings that have to do with willpower, of the will kind of being exuded on the world, or manifesting. I think all of these words are quite active in nature. They are geared toward achieving something through action, through concerted effort or thought, through very defined ideas, whereas I view receptive magic as the absence of those things, where we are receiving something instead of inciting it or seeking it out actively, of course. I in some ways view there's the sort of masculine feminine duality, or those two counterparts. I don't necessarily think that this falls under that category, but you might think of it in that way if it's helpful for you. For me, receptive magic is when I engage in my spiritual practice without any goal in mind. So a big portion of that is that I have nothing that I want out of what I'm doing in that moment. So there's a lot less pressure, there's less stress. I don't actually have to do anything. So in a way, it is inactive, and you might also argue, or I might argue, that the option or the choice to do nothing is still something. The idea of nothing is quite abstract, and while we are alive as human beings, we really won't ever encounter or be able to fathom the idea of true nothingness. But in more relative, colloquial terms, the idea of doing nothing is still something. So you're being receptive. Those days or long spans of time when we don't want to engage in our magical practice, or we feel like we're burnt out in a rut, we have nothing we necessarily want to do, or we don't feel compelled to approach our altar or sacred space for any sort of reason, or we don't have the energy to engage in it in that way. I know this happens to me quite often. I do have a video on coping with or sorting or getting through magical burnout in some ways, or spiritual burnout, and I do stand by that video, although it's a little bit older. I'll link it in the cards above. I would say the measures that I suggest there are a lot more active, whereas what I'm going to be speaking to today is a lot more in the realm of passive receiving. So those days, and I know many of us do this, when we may just sit in our sacred space with nothing in our mind. We don't have a goal when we approach it. We sit in the chair, we look at our items, we just allow ourselves to exist. I think existing is a form of passive or receptive magic for those of us who are spiritual, who view ourselves as witches or practitioners, whatever your title or identifier might be, if you choose one. I personally don't really give myself much of a title. I would say I would consider myself more of like a magical being, or somebody who's very interested in the esoteric, the metaphysical, the magical. I would say my existence itself is something that I view as magical, and so when I am in a more receptive state, I'm already practicing receptive or passive magic. But lighting candles, for example, in my sacred spaces, for no other reason just to enjoy them or just to have them going, I view as passive magic. It's really being in the space. And sometimes what happens when I'm practicing receptive magic, the idea of receiving, you do receive something. You receive, I would say, a feeling from that. You might receive relaxation, you might receive inspiration. So while there's no goal, while you aren't chasing something to obtain it, you are open in some way. You're making yourself more open so that something might arrive in your space, whether that is, for example, yes, inspiration, energy, whatever it might be. I think that the idea of just remaining open during those times of practicing in an inactive or a receptive way is really helpful. Receptive or passive magic can take on the form or take on life in the way of pulling cards. When we shuffle just to shuffle the cards, we don't have a question, but we gain comfort, or we feel, I would say, soothed, or like we're in a good space when we shuffle or when we pull cards for no other reason than to just pull them. We don't have a question or an inquiry. We aren't trying to interpret what we see on the table or to fathom some sort of message out of the chaos of the cards, when we really just allow them to sit. When we are observers or the passive sort of receptacle to whatever it is that's taking place outside of us. So we are the passive element within this equation, whereas the world around us can still be quite active. And I think that's part of what makes the idea of passive or receptive magic so interesting. We aren't engaging in our surroundings. We take the sort of secondary role, or we are no longer in some way the protagonist, and we might be a supporting role to the environment that we have around us. We create something and then we take a step back from it and exist within it, as opposed to being the primary arbiter of whatever it is that's going on. So you may pull cards and not try to divine or discern anything from them, and in doing so you might actually find that you have very interesting thoughts that you maybe wouldn't have had previously. You didn't ask a question, for example, but yet you have an answer, or maybe you end up with a question after having pulled the cards or shuffled them because you didn't go in with something so finite, or you didn't put the pressure on yourself. I think the biggest benefit to passive or receptive magic is that there is no pressure. And so for those of us who feel burned out, who don't have the energy, for example, to do something active within our sacred space, to cast spells or to engage in work with maybe a deity or to pull cards in a very methodical way, we don't need a lot of energy to practice receptive magic. If anything, we need little to no energy. We just need to exist and be, and the space or the items or the, I would say, practice itself is really what fills us with energy. And so I think it's really helpful in that way. If you are feeling burnt out or you're lacking, I would say, ideas, inspiration, and things that you want to do, but in some ways you feel like you ought to be doing something, you can find that reframing your idea of doing nothing actually creates something for yourself that's really helpful. So you can do that through pulling cards. I do that all the time, and I know many do as well. I would say the biggest key takeaway from this video, or what we're speaking about today, is that taking acts that seem very mundane or nonsensical, or in some ways we might try to use the self-talk calling ourselves lazy in doing these sorts of things, if we reframe the way that we're thinking about it or the way we're perceiving it as some sort of magical practice where we are actually engaging in something that is helpful, that is profound, then maybe we won't be so hard on ourselves when we just, for example, sit at our sacred space or light candles or just pull cards casually. It doesn't have to be, I would say, so planned out. It doesn't have to be so structured. It can just be what it is, and enjoying it for what it is, as opposed to finding ways to poke holes in it or to ridicule it. Not ridicule it, that's a really harsh word, but I would say sometimes when we are in those states, we take the small things that we're doing and think that they're not enough, when maybe if we were to view them as being something completely their own in their own category, they would feel like very, I would say, powerful acts. I think the idea of being open and receptive is sometimes viewed as weak or lesser or lazy, when in actuality I think it has its place and it needs its place. And I think active roles of magic are the ones that we constantly think we need to be doing, and that is what is viewed as valid, or the type of magic that is difficult or proficient for those of us who have maybe been doing this for a while, whereas the other forms might be viewed as, I would say, less valid, less savory, easy in some ways. And I don't think being receptive is necessarily easy. I think it requires a concerted effort in recognizing what it is. I think it's about awareness. Awareness is receptive. I think self-awareness is passive in some ways, just to observe the self. I think, therefore I am. The whole philosophical argument of being, existence, I think all of that falls under the vast umbrella of what receptive or passive magic might be. So this is a lot about the understanding of the self. This is a lot about, or at least it deals in the idea of reframing the way that we think of what we're doing, or when we're doing things that we think are less productive. I think societal norms of productivity and action and needing to have something tangible or concrete come out of what we're doing, I think that has warped the way that we maybe practice magic and tilted the scales more toward the active side versus the receptive side, which now seems to be viewed as inferior because it doesn't necessarily give us anything. And when it does, it can't be, I would say, counted on for having something that we can garner from it, something that we can harvest from the act itself. So that's one way. Sometimes I'll just sit with a crystal, and you might view meditation. I still think meditation is quite an active practice in some ways. You sit down with the intention. Intention to me is inherently active, whereas sitting with no intention and closing one's eyes, that is receptive or passive. So it's easy, I think, to see certain forms of magic as being quite passive when we are open on the new moon to messages, but we go into that practice with the intention of being open and receiving a message. The idea of being receptive in magic is to have no intention. So if I were to just see this crystal, I think it looks pretty on my sacred space, and I just decide to sit like this with my eyes closed. There's no reason, there's nothing I'm trying to gain from it. I don't have an outcome in mind. I don't have something that I'm trying to slowly piece together over time through a practice. I'm not trying to make this regimented. I'm not setting a timer. I just sit, and whatever happens, happens. And if nothing happens, that's fine too. I think that's part of the beauty of it. Another way that I do this, I mentioned, was just lighting all of the candles in my room and enjoying the ambiance for what it is. You might take, for example, the more receptive elements if you work with the elements, or if you work with deities, gods, goddesses. You might take the more quote-unquote receptive elements that have to do with those themes and just surround yourself with them. There's no reason why I need to bring this cup out. I don't need to explain it to myself. I don't need to rationalize why I would be holding it or what I would be using it for, but I might just hold it and hold on to it in a seat, and I'm maybe unintentionally thinking of something, or suddenly a moment later inspiration strikes, but I'm not so concerned or attached to the outcome of the practice or the action. I'm much more concerned with just being and doing and existing. And I think that's what passive or receptive magic really is. This is a bit of a ramble. I thought it would just serve as some either inspiration or get some chatter going, get everybody thinking. I love watching videos where people just share their ideas, whether it's word vomit, whether it's very coherent and put together and there's some sort of exercise. Doesn't matter too much to me, so I thought I would just hop on and share my 2 cents on this aspect or category or facet of magic. I'd love to know what you all think. I know that we all engage in this at times, but I do think we could benefit from paying more mind to the idea of passive or receptive magic, and maybe tilting the scales to level things out a little bit of adjustment there. So let me know what you think. I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting or you enjoyed it. And until next time, bye.